Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing great and having a fabulous weekend. So before we get started with tonight's story, go and spoil yourself, get yourself something sparkling to drink, because I've got a lovely story for you this evening. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. It was a grim, cheerless day, clouded by a foggy, subdued greyness that choked the sky with a heavy cloud cover that looked unlikely to abate. The ominous weather spoke of a promise that was about to be unleashed, a threat that was hanging over the day with a suffocating certainty. A churlish, cantankerous storm was brewing on the horizon, and it hinted to the landscape that it would be there very soon. The trees listened to this clandestine warning, their boughs shaking with indignation, as a wind whispered through them, telling all who would listen to brace themselves for the coming wrath. If you were instinctive, you'd have picked up the stealth-like universal messages, as the indigenous animals most certainly had. The birds had wisely hearkened to the indelible signs and flown up to their safe canopy in the trees. Rabbits had returned to the secure confines of their burrows, and dogs persuaded their owners they needed to be brought indoors. Hamish sighed warily as he made his way to the cemetery. He hated coming to this desolate place. He parked his truck on what was once a pristine parking bay, but the red bricks had been terrorized and overtaken by the tenacious weeds and grass. The weather wore a disagreeable, uncooperative appearance, like a truculent teenager having a hissy fit, and Hamish hoped with all his heart that the dark clouds would calm down and finally fade away, but he doubted that this would be the case. The sorrowful church building that had once been an illustrious, prominent landmark in this part of the world, that so many people had regarded with pride, had made absolutely sure was well maintained over the years, was now begging for attention, crying out to be lifted out of its lugubrious melancholia, for it wore the heaviness of the cemetery around its foundations like a suffocating choker chain around a lady's neck. It seemed abandoned, lost, forgotten, forsaken, and desperately neglected, drowning in its interminable grief like a half-starved orphan kitten on the side of the road that everyone disregarded and overlooked. It was almost as if the church itself could not comprehend why it was no longer honoured and esteemed in this generation, as it had been in former bygone years, when everyone had treated the place with honour and respect. But not any more. Those glory days were long gone. The derelict church had not been used for a very long time. Its red brick seemed to have become stone-washed after years spent bleached by the sun. There was unforgiving trails of ivy, winding their way audaciously around the building, as if even the vegetation wanted to strangle the poor place into oblivion, steal away its very heart and soul, as if nobody cared a damn any more. Hamish felt exceedingly annoyed about the bleak condition of the old abandoned building that had been a prominent feature in the 1800s, where people had painstakingly placed magnificent huge flower arrangements at the pulpit of the church, while volunteers had polished all the wood and silver until it gleamed so brightly that you could see your reflection in everything, while the glorious stained-glass windows twinkled at one time so brightly in the church with their rich, vibrant, resplendent colours of the stained glass, displaying images of Christ that grabbed everyone's attention, but not any more. It was such a bleeding shame that such a phenomenal piece of American architecture from the 1800s had been so rudely unacclaimed, left to wallow in a deep cloud of depression. Hamish reluctantly climbed out of his gold Hyundai, finding himself unusually drawn towards the church, in a way he'd never been before, almost as if the church itself was beckoning to him, like an old friend. Maybe it sensed Hamish was one of few people that celebrated old neglected buildings like this, the unsung heroes of 1800s architecture. It was almost as if the stained-glass windows, obscured by a plethora of dust, were pleading him to be rescued, for someone to be kind enough to wipe away their dust and polish them up again. He walked over to the church and pushed open the arched wooden door. It squeaked on its hinges, crying out in protestation, hungry for an oiling, and a little tender loving care. As Hamish entered the church, he saw the sad little wooden pews lined up together in long rows on either side, heavily cloaked with silken webs, while a fine dust covered everything so thickly that you could have easily written your name in it. Hamish noticed that indeed someone had done just that, as on one of the pews was written the words, "Rob was here with Linda," that was scrolled in the dust. That was when Hamish's attention was drawn to something distinctly incongruous in the church that seemed out of place, even in this abandoned place of worship. It was the most massive nest on top of the podium, where sticks had been overlaid neatly in precise angles, covered with fine moss and animal pelts. It was like a monstrously huge bed that measured over 10 feet long and 5 feet wide, and surprisingly enough it looked rather comfortable, although the animal pelts smelt a little niffy. There was a large Coca-Cola bottle filled with water on the side of the bed, along with an unusual pile of interesting stones, some that were quite striking. Hamish bent down on his hands and knees to examine the stones in his hands. He'd never seen river stones like this before, filled with such flamboyant colours, from rich reds to greens, blues and purples. The sort of illustrious collection that would look good on a coffee table and certainly invite comment and interested speculation. Hamish wondered who would find river stones like this. He would have liked to have taken the stones away with him, but an inkling told him that they were not abandoned or forsaken, but part of someone's personal prize collection. What the hell, he thinks, feeling perturbed by what he's seeing, as the strange nest-like bed in a desolate, lonely church makes no sense at all. He was not sure what to make of all this. It looked like something was using the church during the winter months for shelter, but if that was the case, it didn't explain the animal pelts or the interesting collection of stones. In Hamish's discerning, judicious eyes, the nest looked like it had been made by someone very intelligent, a vagrant perhaps, who had made the bed in the church during the winter when it had been icy cold out there. He shrugged his shoulders, pleased to know that at least someone had found a use for the old church. As if there was anything that he loathed, it was waste of any kind. It didn't matter what the waste was. It could be not eating all the groceries you bought at the supermarket, or being forced to throw out leftovers, or an abandoned property that was benefiting no one. The old church fitted the latter criteria admirably, and if it had offered some poor soul shelter and comfort during the bleak, cruel winter they'd just had, it had been a place of God after all, even in its God-forsaken state, as it had offered someone refuge. Hamish's brown eyes glanced across the graveyard that extended back for many miles, where the tenacious weeds grew tallest around the stones of the most weathered graves, degraded by years of harsh, unkind exposure to the elements, eroded by moss and lichen, where the names of the faithfully departed had been abolished and worn away from the stones, almost as if they no longer existed. These were the graves from people who had died from a cholera outbreak in the 1820s, and the smaller graves spoke of little children who had not survived its devastating grip, which tugged grievously at Hamish's heart. He hated to think of little children dying so young, before they even begun to enjoy their lives, but he acknowledged to himself that back in the day, life was so much harder for many. The young man ambled over to the gravestones that stood stoically composed and silent. Even the vandals had showed no interest in disturbing this part of the graveyard, almost as if in some way the ancient cholera epidemic still left its imperishable impressions on the soil here. It might just be contagious from the lingering aftermath of such a devastating illness that had wiped out the lives of so many without discrimination. Who knew the strange things people could naturally presume? Maybe it was a good thing. It kept those kind of people away. Hamish was surprised to see that not even a lone cigarette butt or a sweet wrapper had trespassed over this area. He found that intriguing, as he found the graves that were old and neglected to be of the greatest curiosity of all, over and above the more modern introductions to a graveyard. "Who were you, little one?" says Hamish, stroking a little gravestone affectionately, as if it were the soft blonde curls of a young boy who needed some light encouragement. He warily walked away from the crooked old gravestones towards the trunk of his car, where he removed the wicker basket that contained all his essential supplies for the job he had in mind, that needed doing as efficiently and as quickly as possible. Spritzer bottles containing harsh chemicals, paint remover, bristle brushes, scrapers, grass clippers, a trowel, glass cleaner, trash bags, gloves and wet wipes. Spring was on her merry way, and her ethereal, dainty, elegant hands on the landscape had indeed sparked the renewal of brand new life, most notably displayed in the show-stopping cherry blossom trees, crab apples and dogwoods, where their boughs were weighted down with a plethora of pretty blossoms. Indeed, the trees were like radiant flashes of beauty in this forsaken, shunned graveyard that seemed almost as desolate and lost as the old church building itself. The sequestered cemetery smelt of balsam, pitch, and the sweet-smelling blossoms of the butterfly bushes, bursting with purple blossom, intermingled with the delightful scent of crab-apple blooms. Hamish glanced up at the sky, almost begging for it to restrain its tears, as he could well do without the impending downpour that would easily threaten to hijack all his plans. He ambled through the cemetery, following the meandering gravel paths. The cemetery was situated in a rural area outside of New York. It was the anniversary of his mother's death 10 years on, when she had fortuitously been hit by a truck, driven by an unlicensed miner, at a zebra crossing outside the school that he had attended as a young boy. At that time, the graveyard had been better maintained. Not any more, though. In those days, weeds had been painstakingly removed from the grass. Hedges had been sheared and pruned. Someone had been overseeing the graveyard, keeping unwanted visitors at bay. But not any more. Things from thenceforth had gone steadily downhill at a rapid pace. Hamish needed to attend to his mother's grave before his sister and father arrived on the scene for their annual reunion to the gravesite, as they did every year like clockwork. When spring bobbed her head around the corner, Hamish always knew the gravesite yearly ritual was coming up. He did not want them to see what he knew he would find, what he always found year after year without fail. He didn't want to cause his father undue distress. But the vandals that visited the graveyard knew no respect for the dead. They left their indelible marks here, with unbridled foul words and nasty innuendos on the gravestones, as if they were desirous to torment the souls of the departed and disallow them to rest in peace. Hamish knew only too well who came here, most often young teenagers, with a deep fascination for the occult. And then there were ghost hunters, and worst of all, the vandals who came here to deface the gravestones, as getting their revenge on someone that could not fight back seemed expediently fruitful as far as they were concerned. Then there were the drug addicts and drunks, who often gravitated towards the graveyard for some inexplicable reason. Perhaps they found more solace in seeking the comfort of the dead than spending time in the presence of the living, who would be far too quick to judge them for their intoxicating indulgences that knew their scoffers no patience. The green colour of the grass, after the long savage winter and blistering snowfall, had been ruthlessly bleached, but it was fighting back tenaciously, as verdant shoots were audaciously plundering through the earth. But equally as forceful were the ugly weeds, determined to harness their graceless exhibits between the gravestones, while a jungle of creepers, climbers and unkept ivy snaked through the grass, like silent boa constrictors determined to throttle anything it touched. Hamish ambled through the graveyard towards his mother's gravestone, his heart heavy with the disappointment of what he saw. There were pentagrams, upside-down crosses, the number 666 scrawled across gravestones in angry red paint, defacing them with the menacing intentions that those symbols embodied. Worse still were the foul words scrawled across stones that seemed to be bad-mouthing the dead themselves, without regret or restraint. What on earth was wrong with this current generation? Hamish wondered. He had been a teenager himself not too long ago, although in truth it may as well have been another lifetime. He couldn't remember a time when he'd been so unquenchably rebellious as to behave like this. He knew he would not have been capable of plastering someone's place of rest with red paint and foul offensive words. It was nonsensical that people could have so little respect for those who had passed on. If you went back in history, you would see generations of people respecting the dead, going back to the days of the pharaohs, but not any more. Hamish agonized over this, As his eyes grew indignantly solemn, he noticed the black melted wax tangled between the grass, burnt incense, cigarette stubs, candy wrappers, drug paraphernalia, condoms, empty bottles and crushed cans. He fastidiously began cleaning around the gravestones, filling up his trash bags with all the nasty litter that carpeted the ground so offensively. He filled up 4 big trash bags, replacing them in the trunk of his car. He then returned to his mother's grave, appalled to see the provocatively objectionable writing all over the stone. Bitch was painted across her grave, along with a few more unmentionable bellicose words that left Hamish very discomposed. The young man found an anger coursing through his veins that seemed as volatile and as potentially explosive as the weather itself, but he turned his focus on removing all the nasty paint. Of course he knew that it was a rite of passage for many youngsters to dabble in witchcraft, to communicate with the dead, but this chaotic mess, this outright blatant disrespect for the dead, appalled him. These people needed to be stopped, he thought. Someone needs to stop them. He could count on his hand the number of times he'd been to the police station to talk about the blatant abuse of the graveyard here. But it seemed like the officers he spoke to were far more concerned with serious crimes on their beat than a few gravestones being decimated, which was low on their priority list. "We do patrol the area from time to time," he was told, "but it's not easy to catch these young louts getting up to their nonsensical mischief. Our hands are tied. There's not much we can do about this problem. We're dealing with an increased spate of burglaries on our watch, and graveyards are the last thing on our priority list. Maybe you should address this issue with the town council." Hamish knew that if the town council had not bothered to attend to the graveyard over the last 6 years, when the graveyard had become an eyesore, why would they do so now? Things were not likely to change in the foreseeable future. He began to tackle the weeds that played their part in vandalising his mother's gravestone, as they weaved their way around the granite slab, showing no mercy. He pulled away the ivy that was clinging on to the edges of the stone. He worked quickly to clean around the stone and then spent ages chafing away the red paint. Finally he buffed the stone up with a polishing cloth and returned to his truck to wait for his father and sister to arrive. They should be here in any minute. He glanced at the time on his cell phone, and then at the pewter-coloured sky. For a second he tried to negotiate with the weather, to hold on a little bit longer. "Please," he begged internally, "please, let us just get on with the ceremony, and then you can come down in buckets if you like, but not until we've said our piece to our mother, like we do every year. Please don't ruin it for us." Soon his sister's white Honda Civic was now parking next to his truck on the overgrown red brick driveway of the old neglected church. He watched her slim silhouette climbing out of the car, hurrying over to the passenger side door to help her father out of the truck, which was always a laborious struggle. It would seem their father was old beyond his years. He groaned as he manoeuvred himself out of the truck very awkwardly, with his walking stick as his only means of stabilising support. After their mother's fortuitous death, Hamish's father had become like a parrot that picks and plucks at its own feathers due to stress and anxiety. Archibald Harrison had always been a little eccentric, but their mother Heather had understood her husband's quirky habits and peculiarities, and loved them all with an adoring admiration that he unequivocally knew he'd never find in another woman. Let's just say Archibald knew the love of his life, the mother of his 2 beloved children, Heather Harrison, could never ever be replaced. He could scour the kingdom 100 times over, and never find another woman quite like her. And even if he could, he'd never want to replace her, as that would almost be treacherous in his opinion, and undermine the beauty of the unique love that they had shared together. The 2 of them had complemented each other, like salt's affinity with pepper, or maple syrup's relationship with soft, fluffy pancakes. Granted, he had known of men quick to replace their wives after their passing, as they couldn't bear the loneliness or seclusion of not sharing their lives with someone else. Yet for Archibald, he would rather live with his memories than an impostor posing as his second wife. No one could fill his wife's role. It would be like making a cheap replacement for Jif peanut butter. You just couldn't do it. The inferior, cheaper brands would be overshadowed by the original. Heather Harrison was the original in every regard that simply could not be substituted or replaced. Yes, it did get lonely. He wasn't ashamed to admit. The days could sometimes be long and dreary, with one nondescript mundane day folding into yet another. The memories of the past would rewind in his recall, like an old nostalgic record, playing wistful tunes, and they were the reasons he could get up in the morning to face yet another day. He was so glad of his happy memories, for they were his priceless precious treasures that could never be stolen from him, for they were safely buried in his heart, away from the prying eyes of thieves and vandals. Archibald's weathered face was overtaken by fine lines that made his face like an interesting road map of the world. His blue piercing eyes were lugubriously sorrowful, his body frail and emaciated. No one was more surprised than he was that he was still alive. He learnt it was common for one partner to die soon after the other, and he had accepted that that would ultimately happen to him. In truth, he didn't know why he was still here. He grimaced as he straightened his body out, leaning over to his walking stick to steady himself. For a brief moment he stared at the bedraggled church that looked so sorrowful in its neglect. He almost commiserated with the uncherished, disesteemed church building, whispering to it in his heart, "Don't worry, old fellow. I feel just like you look." He sighed heavily as he straightened his back and climbed out of the seat, wobbling unsteadily on his frail legs. How he loathed coming to this untended, time-worn graveyard, a habitude that the family honoured every single year. In truth, he never felt his wife was rarely there. Her body may be under the ground, but her spirit was long since departed. It would seem going through the motions with this family ritual year after year did bring a small satisfactory measure of comfort, even if it was very brief. Besides, it was significantly important for his wife, wherever she was, to know that she was never forgotten and was sorely missed by them all. Archibald did not have strong religious beliefs of any kind, but he had discerned a long time ago that there really would not be any point to anything if this life was all there was. He was sure that there was a bigger picture in the grand scheme of things. After his wife's unexpected death, he often had moments he could swear he was not alone, and could sense her loving presence. Then there was the curious matter of the occasional penny that would randomly appear on his wife's side of the bed, usually on her pillowcase, that he was sure was a sign from Heather, reminding him that she was still very much around and watching over him. "Are you all right, Dad?" Cordelia asks her father, removing the basket of white doves from the trunk, along with a big bouquet of white roses, which she threw over the top of the basket. "Look over there, Dad, it's Hamish," she says, pointing to the casual blonde-headed figure of her brother walking over towards them with a wide smile on his face and giving his father a big friendly pat on the back. "How you doing, Dad?" he asked. "As well as can be expected, son," said the old man. "And you, Cordelia?" he asks. She shrugs her shoulders. So. "Still having problems with that boyfriend of yours?" "I'm afraid so. He lounges around the apartment all day, not lifting a single finger. He hasn't even tried to find a job. I don't think he even wants to work. He enjoys being a kept man, spending all day watching Netflix. Normally I wouldn't mind if he pulled his weight around the place, kept our apartment in a halfway decent condition. But no, that's just too much to ask him. He doesn't lift a bloody finger. I return home to a dump. Dirty dishes piled high in the sink and the slob passed out on the sofa, snoring loudly, not doing a damn thing. Honestly, our bulldog Roly-Poly is more active than he is. And take it from me, that's really saying something. I'm the one that comes back home exhausted, and I have to clean and get dinner started after a hectic day at the office. Frankly, I've had enough." "It sounds like you need to draw a line in the sand," says Hamish. "If he doesn't change his lackadaisical ways, he should leave. Tell him he needs to go." "It's easier said than done," says Claudia, sighing. "I still love him to death, you know. I'm a glutton for punishment. I know I am."
"Goodness gracious, girl! What would your mother say about all this?" says her father, looking appalled. "Your boyfriend treats you like this, and you're still in love with the man? There is no fool like an old fool, if you ask me. Here, let me help you, sis," says Hamish, taking the large basket of white doves out of his sister's hands to relieve her of her heavy load, while she removes the white roses and carries them with her. "Shall we go?" he asks. "I don't like the look of that leaden sky." says her father with concern. The last thing we need to do is to be caught up in a storm. I'm afraid today it looks like we're going to need to hurry.
The three of them walk briskly through the grass. There's a cool wind blowing, but the Argentine ashen sky looks ominously dark, and you can almost smell the storm in the air. The white doves can sense the imposing threat. They're making a disgruntled flapping noise in their basket, as if they want to fly away home now, before the storm suddenly breaks. The grass sways in the wind as they move towards their mother's gravestone.
Thank God the vandals haven't put graffiti over Heather's stone,
says their father, sighing with relief, as if grateful for small mercies.
They seem to have messed up every other gravestone in the cemetery, but thankfully your mother's is undisturbed by some miraculous miracle.
Little did he know the half of it, thought Hamish to himself. Thank God he hadn't been here earlier. He'd have been very distressed.
All right, who's going first?
Says their father obsequiously. He looks at Hamish, as if expecting him to take the lead.
Hi, Mum, he says. We're all gathered around your gravestone to remember your life on the 10th anniversary of your death. It's as if you only died the other day. It's still raw to us now, as it was back then all those years ago. Especially for Father, especially for him. I can't believe you've been gone for 10 years already. I still get stopped in the street, you know, by people who used to be taught by you at the local school. Everyone remembers you very much, Mum, as a vibrant teacher that didn't suffer fools gladly. I hope wherever you are, you're well.
He pauses for a brief moment.
Well, you know how I love going surfing at the beach not too far from here. Well, I met a remarkable surfer, as passionate about the sport as I am last year. Possibly a few weeks after our last reunion. Well, he took me to surf the largest waves in the entire world that are 100 feet high in Portugal, in a place called Nazaré. And, Mum, I did it. Can you bloody believe it, Mum? I did it. I still keep playing the event over and over again in my mind. I've never had such a remarkable thrill like that before. There is no feeling like it in the entire world. Can you believe it? I surfed 100-foot wave. It was the most exhilarating experience of my entire life. One wrong move, and I could have been thrashed to death by a wave like a concrete building coming down on top of me. But I figured, what's life if you don't live it to the fullest, Mum? And take the risks others may not be prepared to take. Many have lost their lives surfing at Nazaré, but like me, they deemed it a worthwhile risk to take. I know someone who broke his back from one of those waves, but he's recovering well and can't wait to get back on the wave again, despite coming so close to meeting his maker. Mum, you feel so small out there when you're riding 100-foot wave that is so powerful, but it's the most exhilarating feeling in the entire world. I can't help wondering if you feel as free in heaven as I feel out there on the ocean. Surfers come to Nazaré from all around the world to attempt to ride these waves. Other than dreaming about my next surfing expedition in Portugal, life's been pretty humdrum. But I think of you all the time, Mum. I miss you madly.
Hi, Mum. It's me, says Cordelia, taking her cue. I wish I could boast conquering 100-foot wave like Hamish can, but I prefer to have my feet firmly on the ground. So Hamish makes my life seem insipidly dull by contrast. I think of you all the time as well. I miss you so much. There's a huge hole in our lives without you, even after 10 years. I'm still living with Barker Collins. I know if you were alive you'd be giving me a hard time about him, and you'd be right. Let's just say he's as lazy as ever, expecting me to pick up after him all the time. I want to kick him out of my apartment, but I just can't because I love him too much. It's like having a spoiled kid at home that I'm looking after, and although he's like a pampered pooch, I'm too attached to him to give him his marching orders. I know you'll think me a mug. I bought him a decent truck for his birthday. My girlfriends think I'm insane, and that Barker is taking advantage of my generosity, and they're right. They look at me as if I'm a complete idiot. As for the life of them, they don't know what I see in the man. He wants to marry me, but so would I want to marry me, if I had it as good as him. But I'm not prepared to make that commitment, unless he pulls up his socks. I may be many things, but unless he changes, marriage is not on the cards. Work is all right. I enjoy some of the challenges at the office, but other than that, everything is much of a much. Dad, it's your turn, says Cordelia, looking at her father tenderly. Last but definitely not least, Dad.
Hello, sweetheart. It's hard to believe it's been 10 years. Where does the time get to? You would be proud of me, the things I do for myself these days. I went on a cookery course a month ago, so my food, I dare say, would even impress you. I wish you could try my corn chowder. It's quite delicious. I know you love corn chowder. And I make a mean pork shoulder as well. I'm still receiving the coins on the pillow. I know they're from you. Keep them coming, sweetheart. It makes me feel not quite so alone. I think of you all the time, sweetheart. Hundreds of times a day, in fact. But I don't need to tell you that. My heart aches with your absence, but when I'm hurting, I remember the good times. We had so many of those, didn't we? I don't know what else to say, sweetheart, to you. But you have my heart. You always have, and you always will. And for God's sake, don't go chatting up any other men at the pearly gates, because I'm watching you. You may be on the other side, but you're still my wife as far as I'm concerned, so don't you dare forget that. Goodbye, Mum, they say at once. Natalie walks over to the wicker basket and opens the clasp to release the white doves, who fly up into the air in flapping white ribbons, floating up into the cinereal clouds. They look magnificent, the sharpness of the white standing out prominently against the gunmetal sky. Cordelia dutifully places the white roses in a vase with water in it next to the grave. The timing is perfect, as all of a sudden all hell breaks loose. The thunder booms. The unforgiving sooty sky permits the lingering clouds to finally unleash their heavy, unforgiving loads of water onto the thirsty earth, while the jagged lightning strikes, whipping the sky angrily, and an unbridled charging wind that knows no restraint hurtles through the trees like one of the rambunctious waves Hamish so often surfs. It didn't hold back as it punnelled violently against their clothes. The towering statuesque trees in the graveyard begin to move vigorously, in time to the moaning, groaning, whooshing sounds of the jejune wind. Hamish, Cordelia and their elderly father tries to scurry through the desolate-looking graveyard, back to the truck as fast as they can. But they were not unscathed by the rain that pounded upon them in sheets. Finally they made it to their trucks in time, and parted company, bidding each other farewell. So there we are, that's the end of part 1 of our story, and I do advise you to have a look at some of those waves at Nazarene. 100-foot wave, you haven't seen anything like it, it's extraordinary. Until next time, goodbye and good night.